believe your special interest is the Roman army?
More or less, yes. Most things that are violent in antiquity interest me. I think that's a fair way of putting it. But no, I'm only here briefly to say hello to people on the ether, because I'm currently the chairman of the local branch of the Classical Association. And just to say, by way of publicity, we do have a series of talks. Most of them are up at Keele Hall, but occasionally they're roundabout. And also we do things like play readings in translation. So if anyone's interested in the classics, please do sign the little book that's going round. If you put your email down there, we will just add you to our email list, and then we'll notify you of when these things are coming along. The next one is actually also a Manchester person, so if you're interested in Manchester, you get a full bunch of the stuff here. My colleague Christian Lycey will be talking about disabilities in the ancient world. But I'm very pleased to briefly introduce now my colleague Jules Abad from Manchester. Jules is a literary classicist rather than a historian like me. Her doctorate was on epic poetry, although not Greek, in fact Roman epic poetry. This has been a learning experience for her already. Until about a quarter of an hour ago, she didn't know what a ghost train was, but now she does know what a ghost train is, so that's good. And on that spooky note, I'll hand over to Jules to talk to us about Homer's Underworld.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you so much for coming. It is my pleasure to be here today to talk more about sort of the Homeric Underworld. As it has been said, I will do a little bit of an overview of Book 11 primarily, which is where we see the descent into the underworld, and we'll talk about some of the themes that Homer sort of puts forward in this book. And of course, it's very timely. Spooky season is upon us, so this is just in time sort of for Halloween. So again, this is a sort of for you to see a taste of the rest of the day. So we do an overview of the Underworld episode in the Odyssey. We'll talk a little bit more about sort of the technicalities for journeying down. You know, what do you do? How do you get to hell? It's not that easy, as we will see. Then we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the underworld and how important it is for the cultural imagination, especially of the West. And I'm hoping to get some sort of feedback from you on some parallels that you may have seen in modern sort of media of sort of scenes of descents into hell. And then we'll sort of cover some spectral encounters, right? Because Odysseus meets several people in the underworld. We can't go through all of them in 45 minutes, but we'll sort of focus, have a deep dive into some of those. And I put on the slide a very evocative painting by Fuseli, which is a shade of Tiresias, so the blind prophet Tiresias, appearing to Odysseus after sort of the sacrifice, the things that Odysseus has to do in order sort of to call and be able to communicate with the dead. And I think it's actually very accurate when we see the description of what Odysseus has to do. It's very accurate, and I think that it's just a very neat image, right? And again, as I said, just in time for Halloween. So we start, I think, with a quote by Joseph Campbell on why sort of the stories across mythical traditions, why stories about the underworld matter, and what is it about those stories that continues, I think, to fascinate ourselves and us, even sort of in the contemporary world. So according to Campbell, in this book, which is quite interesting on comparative mythology, if you're interested in how Homer might be working perhaps with other earlier iterations of similar myth, the book is called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And he says that the hero or the heroine's descent to the underworld is often preceded by the idea of a call to initiation. So it's the beginning of a sort of journey, right? And we can take that to mean both a metaphorical journey, but more also a literal journey of going down into hell. And in this journey, we have a separation from family, for the most part, and from the home environment. And Campbell says that the journey down entails sort of going into the depths of the earth, right? And in that journey, sort of a mirror for the look inward into oneself. And he says that it is a murky journey, leaving the sunlight and the familiar terrain to wander in darkness. And we'll see how that might be true for Odysseus as a hero. And it is a time of reflection, of solitude. This may not or may not be true of Odysseus, and doubt. And this is especially clear in later literature after Homer. And there is mourning as well in these journeys, and we will see that as well. And there is always the potential danger lurking, and there is estrangement from our sense of who we are. Right? So the underworld is sort of a descent into the underworld. Is not just going down and you have random encounters, but it actually has profound implications for Odysseus as a character. And we will see how and in what ways that might matter. So, for those of you who are not entirely familiar with book 11 yet, you're in book 9, actually one of the climactic moments of the narrative with the Cyclops. In the underworld, so this is book 11, sometimes you will see it described as nekyria, which is literally comes from the Greek word from corpse, right? From cadaver, meaning coming from nekus. So sometimes that is a technical term for the descent into the underworld. And the underworld episode, and I hope that you can see it, especially those on my left-hand side. The underworld episode occurs at the center of the Odyssey. So if you were to take sort of a very structural view of book 11, right, and the Odyssey as a whole, but book 11 especially, you will see that within the wanderings, so from book 9 to book 12, the underworld occupies a middle piece. Right? And we see, I think, a mirroring structure in the way that the underworld episode is presented. And you basically have a mirroring structure in which you have, for example, the Cyclones at the very beginning when when Odysseus leaves Troy, and then the Phaeacians. And as you sort of go inwards, then you'll find the underworld in the middle. It's a very debated book because some scholars believe that it's a later edition, that it doesn't quite fit in, it doesn't find patterns repeated within the broader sort of Odyssey. But I think that actually it matters for the way that Odysseus is characterized, from elements that matter for our understanding of key themes of the Odyssey. And some of these are the theme of hospitality, which is a repeated theme of, I would say, one of the most important sort of motifs. But it also presents reflections on marriage, and we'll see what Agamemnon says about women in a little bit. We also see how the underworld ties in ideas of nostos. Right? Odysseus at this point is at the crossroads. He has to go down to the underworld because he has been told to go there, and he has to sort of find more information so that he can return home. So this is, even though the underworld episode doesn't fit it, it has important repercussions for how the story is going to play out. And also we have the important sort of the underworld episode sort of, gives us a glimpse as to the relationship of Odysseus with some of his companions. And we see one of them in particular, and ideas of kleos. So how the idea of fame, which we might be familiar with the Iliad, actually changes a little bit, and we see a different side to what it means to be a Homeric hero. Okay, so these are the things that we were going to be seeing today, and I call this "Welcome to Hell." It's probably not that friendly, but hopefully that you sort of come into the journey with me. So, because, as I said, there is a distinction between the heroic presence of, say, an Achilles, the great hero in the Iliad, and Odysseus in the Odyssey. One of the things that the Underworld episode does in Homer is to create a distinction between what happens to you after you die. Okay? So, in the Iliad, the idea is that warriors are fighting and they're getting their sort of 50 minutes of fame retold in song, and that is a way for them to sort of persist beyond death and to gain that immortality. And we see that in the Iliad several times, and I put some on the slides. We have no Underworld episode in the Iliad. We have the hero Heracles. He doesn't get immortality, he's dead. Right? This is how the story goes in the Iliad. So we have no immortalization. There is nothing that happens to these heroes after death. They just die. And their immortality, their glory, their kleos, is achieved through song. Right? The fact that their acts are being retold by the poet. Book 11 of the Odyssey throws a spanner in the works. It's very, very different because we actually see a world populated by dead people and dead heroes at that. Right? So it's almost like a window into what's going to happen next. Okay? So that's a different way of basically being seen after death. So you will have the underworld populated. But you also see immortality granted to some of the heroes. For example, Menelaus and Helen, which are very prominent in Odyssey 4, we see their future in the Isle of the Blessed. So they will live, well, some say happily ever after. I'm not entirely sure about that, but they will sort of inhabit the Elysian fields, Elysian plains. So, the Underworld in the Odyssey provides us with a different perspective on how does a hero might persist after death. And this is why I think it's a very important book, because it provides us, again, as I said, an alternative version of events, if you will. I think that's very important. And we see that sort of the Underworld, we see that, and we see some of these dead heroes. We see a very crammed, very murky, very dark, a very desolate place in places. And one of the ways in which the poet makes you not like the Underworld, because nobody should like, death, is sort of the repeated phrase, it was equally hateful to both gods and men, right? And even gods feared the river Styx, right? And this is why they swear by it. And so grim, desolate, murky, dark. I think the dank abode of the dead is how one of the translations presents it. And what about those who live in the Underworld? Well, Homer actually uses 3 different ways to refer to the dead. We have sort of souls, right, from the Greek stukai, so you might expect to see sort of souls, but sometimes the inhabitants are described with the word eidola, which literally means images, right? Almost like sort of, I was going to say spirits, but it might not be the best word. It's sort of a phantom, right? Something that you can't quite grasp, you can't quite see. And then sometimes we just get the description of dead, right? Dead corpses, necris, which is from, if you remember what I said before, the necuria, necus means corpse, so it's just sort of a collection of corpses. So we also have different ways to talk about the inhabitants of this very grim place. Now, but how does Odysseus get here? So why Why does he have to go there? Why does he have to make this journey? Circe had asked him in book 10, so a little bit earlier, the sort of enchantress, the witch Circe had sort of pushed Odysseus in a way onto another journey, and this journey of the underworld. And this is, I put on the slide a passage in which Odysseus asks Circe to basically allow him to return home. And he says, fulfill the promise you made me to give me passage home. This is my own eager desire now, right? He just wants to get to Ithaca, right? It's been a while. And he says, it's not just my desire, but it's also that of my companions. And Circe says, sort of answered him straight away, royal son of Laertes, Odysseus, you must stay no longer in my house against your will, right? I will let you go. But first you must complete another journey and go down to the house of Hades and dread Persephone to consult the spirit of Theban Tiresias, the blind prophet. His mind is still as it was, though he's dead. Persephone has granted him sense and thought, I should say, and to him alone all the rest are fleeting shadows. Another translation from that images. So this, sometimes it is said that book 11 doesn't really doesn't really have a purpose, because Circe will tell the same things that, as we would see, we will tell Odysseus the same things that are retold by Tiresias, so there's no point for him to go down. But as I said, there are elements of importance in that journey, because the journey down to the underworld will allow Odysseus to see parts of his lost family, will allow him to see sort of some of the heroes after they returned, or they didn't actually quite make the return from Troy, and will also allow him to see sort of other heroes. And of course, we have to compare him to these other heroes. So Circe says to Odysseus, you must go down and consult the prophet Tiresias. So that is how the journey begins in book 10, at the very, very end of book 10. Of course, if the underworld, if it were a place that would be easy to find, everybody would make that journey. But it's not. And the location, the precise location, is specified with extreme detail in the poem. And Circe tells him that when you have crossed over ocean in your ship, so at the very end of the world, at the very end of the known world, there will be a low shore and a wood, the wood of Persephone. And it has tall poplars and willows that shed the fruit early. And he says, beach your ship there, and you must go on foot into the dank abode of Hades. So again, at the very end. So he has to disembark and he has to make the journey on foot. There we have two rivers, the Phereplagiton and Cocytus, which is a branch of the river Styx. And there is a rock at the confluence of the two rivers, and that is where Odysseus has to sort of conduct some rites, and he has to perform a sacrifice so that the dead will be allowed to speak with him. And it's a very cool, I think, again, the level of detail is outstanding. So we have Odysseus has to dig a trench about a cubit long and wide, which I think is half a meter. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's about this big. He has to pour sort of milk and honey, as well as a little bit of wine, water, and barley grains. When he has made this concoction, he must make some prayers in entreaty to the company of the dead. So you have to appease the shades with this sort of ritual, and then you must sacrifice 2 animals, a ram and a black ewe, and they have to be positioned in a way in a particular way, so turning their heads towards Erebus, and he has to turn away. So it's not an easy thing to do, right? And it's not also it's very technical, right? And I think it matters because it's meant to highlight the complexity of the feat that Odysseus is doing. Not everybody goes down to the dead, and those sort of to the underworld, and those who do are usually ghosts, dead, right? Dead people. And the result of this very fancy sort of ritual is that the dead will gather to the trench, and they will have to sort of drink the blood so that they can come near Odysseus and speak to him. Okay? So the drinking of the sacrificial blood is fundamental for the communication between Odysseus and the dead. And Homer goes again into a lot of detail as to who is it that we find in the underworld. What kind of people? So we have young brides and boys yet unmarried, and this is obviously meant to be quite a pathetic image, right? Because these are people who are cut in the prime of their lives. Also, we have old men who have suffered much, and we have innocent girls with the grief fresh in their hearts, and then men that have been killed in battle. And then from all over, Odysseus says, they all came around me, and finally Odysseus says, I was afraid. And he says, terror took its pale grip. So this is how Odysseus sort of can communicate with the dead, and what the dead have to do is to drink that sacrificial blood. But some of you who might be connoisseurs on sort of the dark arts of magic might point out that we are conflating two images. So one of them is sort of the journey into the underworld, which the technical term for it is katabasis. It comes from the Greek kata baino, literally I go under. Okay, a going under. So the katabasis is the descent into the underworld, and that is one thing. But we also have something else, which is necromantic rituals, by which you summon the spirits of the dead to you, so that you can talk to them. And you can talk to them sort of only after they've drunk that sacrificial blood. It's almost as if the blood acts as a sort of spark of life, that they sort of replenish their blood so that they can again speak, which I think is quite cool. Anyway, on the violent side, so we have these two sort of elements of katabasis and necromancy that are merged into two in the descent, in the underworld, and I think that the two scenes are sort of closely intertwined. And at some point, so we start off with the sort of the necromancy, but at some point the conceit of the drinking of the sacrificial blood sort of fades away from the narrative. So at the very beginning we have quite a lot of emphasis on these ghosts that have to drink it, but then it sort of fades away from the story. So we have these two different elements that I think Homer combines into the narrative of the underworld. Now, if I ask you if you can think of other literary texts, and I accept sort of ancient, that might include a descent into the underworld, what could you say to me? What do you think of that?
Dante's Inferno.
Dante's Inferno, absolutely. And as an Italian myself, wonderful text. If you haven't read The Divine Comedy, do. Is actually, Dante does something which is very clever. Rather than saying, I'm just going to devote one book to sort of the underworld, the whole of the first sort of Inferno is in the underworld. And then we sort of go up. But we're always sort of in sort of a different realm. So Dante's perfect. Any others that you might have come across?
Go on, Arwen. What are you doing in the second year?
The Aeneid.
Daniel, yeah, I mean, some might say that Virgil has taken and sort of copied the entire book 11 in book 6. That's not true. He does different things, but absolutely. The Aeneid. Any other texts? Let's see, I can hear whispering.
Say that. Does the Bible count?
Does the Bible count? Oh,
Does the Bible count?
shows the. Does the Bible count? That's a question I put into the audience. I don't think it does as such, but we do have a sort of resurrection, I would say, coming back from the dead. I'll give you some sort of more example of those ancient narratives. What about contemporary sort of media? I'll accept TV series and movies as well.
Hades is based off a Greek myth.
Hades Town is one of them. Yeah, absolutely.
There's one there's an episode about Hades.
Hades.
About the mice actually, it's about like walking the road and then like leave each comes back.
Okay, so this is called Once Upon a Time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll add that to my list of things that my students might want to know about. Any others?
Percy Jackson.
Percy Jackson, again, somebody else who sort of takes and copies. I was thinking more, if you can think about, I don't know. Think about it, right? 1997. The greatest Disney movie ever made. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Cerberus, right?
No, it's just because
And for those of you who might be familiar with sort of Star Wars, we have, right? The last one is Star Wars Empire Strikes Back. I'm not an entire fan of the Star Wars series, but at the same time, they do something really well, which is they make the underworld in sort of this place called Dagobah. And there is this conversation between Yoda. That place is strong with the dark side of the Force, a domain of evil, right? So if somewhere bad, in you must go. What's in there? Luke asks. Only what you take with you. This is very sort of metaphorical. But now, one of the things that I think bears repeating is that sometimes, especially in modern contemporary media, we see the sort of the underworld as a sort of place of evil, or somewhere morality is sort of corrupted. I don't think that's quite true of Homer. I think Homer does it in a way where you have sort of morality in the Homeric points doesn't quite work as we would expect it. So don't think of the Homeric underworld or sort of somewhere that is sort of scary or might again have a corrupting influence. It's just somewhere where the dead go, and I think we cannot quite make those. But if you notice again, it's a dark place, and you know that is the way it's been sort of thought of, and it's the way that I think Homer has had a huge influence for modern as well and contemporary retellings. So we had the mention of Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, absolutely, and the Virgil's Aeneid 6. Virgil does sort of, he doesn't just copy, of course, Homer. He has he adds sort of innovations. We see, for example, one of the characters there, the ferryman Charon. He's very well fleshed out, and then Dante sort of takes him as well in sort of I think his book Inferno Canto 11. But of course, the underworld doesn't begin with Homer. We have to take into account Gilgamesh in sort of the Sumerian Akkadian epic. We also have a descent into the underworld. Into Gilgamesh has to find sort of Enkidu. So we have that descent. And some scholars are actually working now on understanding the parallels between this earlier epic, that of Gilgamesh, and Homer. So Homer doesn't sort of come up with the idea of the descent into hell. This has always been with us somehow, right? because I think the curiosity that we might have for what happens to us after we die, right? And having a hero that actually goes down into the underworld is something that, again, could be quite fascinating. Ovid, if you're interested in sort of the Roman side of things, also Ovid in Metamorphoses, in the Epic, in books 4 and 5 in particular, sort of stories happen within the underworld. The story of Demeter looking for Persephone is one that is particularly poignant. And also Paradise Lost, of course, we've seen that hell in the very opening of Milton's epic. So this is just a taste of how important and how sort of what a pull basically Homer book 11 and also book 24 of the Odyssey, which we have another underworld scene, have had on the cultural imagination across countries as well and across time. So something to think about. Okay, because time is passing, let's think about a little bit more about the structure of the underworld episode. I'm a fan of structure and I'm a fan of sort of mirroring structures. So the story of the underworld book, actually, as I said, begins at the very end of book 10 with the presence of Elpenor, who's a companion of Odysseus, who unfortunately gets a little bit too drunk, falls on basically off a roof and dies. And it begins with the fact that he hasn't received proper burial. And that is a key element that actually is an integral part of the story of the underworld. So they have to journey, and if we were going to sort of take a mirroring perspective on the underworld, you have the first half in which Odysseus sees 3 very important people in his life concerning Ithaca, which are Elpenor, his companion, Tiresias, the blind prophet, and Anticleia, who's his mother. So that's sort of the first half of the first Odyssey, of the first underworld, pardon me, which is, I said, Nicaea A. Then we have a catalogue of heroines, of women, in which we see sort of princesses retelling their own story and their own sort of marriages and sort of elements of their familiar life. Then we have a break in the very middle of book 11, in which we're sort of taken back to the wider frame of the Odyssey, of what's happening in this retelling, in which we see Odysseus talking to the Phaeacians. And Antinous, the king of the Phaeacians, says to Odysseus, "What a great bard you are! What great stories you are telling me about sort of your journey." Then we return to the story, so we return to Odysseus' own words, and we see another sort of triad of heroes in this case, and we have Agamemnon, Achilles, and Ajax. Right? And if you notice, the first 3 individuals have to do with Ithaca, and the others have to do with Troy. So we have again a mirroring perspective there. And finally, we have the second half of the second underworld scene, in which we have a parade of sort of heroes from the distant past, culminating in the very interesting character of Heracles, right? And that is how it ends. And finally, we return to Circe's island. Odysseus manages to bury Elpenor finally, and that is basically the ring composition of the underworld. That is the basic structure of the story of book 11. So let's take a deep dive into the first 3, and the first 3 encounters that, as I said, they all have to do some way or another with Ithaca. Right? And one of the things that sometimes we forget to think about is that Odysseus has been away from his family for the best part of 19 years, right? 20 years. He hasn't received any news in the meantime of what's happening in Ithaca, what happened to members of his family. He doesn't know anything, right? So part of the reason why he suffers so much is because of an ignorance regarding his life, regarding what's going on in Ithaca. So that, again, solitude and isolation from that family. So the first sort of person that he actually meets is, again, Elpina, which can believe that Odysseus is actually in the underworld. It's quite a funny scene in which they talk to each other. It's like, what are you doing here? Right? And Elpina, Homer is not very kind with him because he says that he's somebody who was not over brave in battle nor well equipped with brains, which I think is a great insult. And he, as I said, he had an unfortunate accident. He drank too much, got up on a roof, and died. Again, a warning to perhaps not drink too much. And he's part of that crew. And the relationship between Odysseus and Elpinor here is that Elpinor says, "I want to be buried, and I want to receive proper rights." Right? And he sort of acknowledges the difficulty in doing so for Odysseus' nostos, for the return, but it's something that sort of he asks, he requires. The second person, the second sort of ghost, I should say really, that Odysseus meets is Tiresias, the reason why he went to the underworld. And the reason why Odysseus has to talk to Tiresias is to get information about basically the last leg of his journey. He gets a warning of not eating the cattle of the sun god Helios. And Tiresias is very honest about this, right? And says, you will find there, when you get to Sicily, the island of Trinacria, you will find cattle and sturdy sheep belonging to Helios. If you leave these unharmed, you may still reach Ithaca. But if you harm them, if you kill the cattle, if you eat it, I warn you of destruction to come for your ship and for your companions. So, big warning, this is what you shouldn't be doing. And of course, it's exactly what happens, right, in book 12. Companions did not listen to this. But the conversation between Odysseus and Tiresias also has the purpose of providing Odysseus with more information about the life in Ithaca at the point in which Odysseus had left. And then he says, Tiresias, you will find trouble in your house, arrogant men consuming your substance, wooing your godlike wife, and offering marriage gifts. But their crimes, you will punish when you arrive. So Tiresias also fills Odysseus in with the fact that once he gets back home, he will find suitors, and he will find that they have basically stolen all of his money, because in the sort of the heroic world, remember that substance is the idea of having sort of cattle and having sort of property. Once the suitors for 20 years have been depleting that, they have been basically robbing Odysseus of his own money, of his own sort of possessions. So Tiresias serves a purpose because, again, it allows Odysseus to understand the situation in Ithaca. And perhaps my favorite bit of the entire Odyssey is another element of Tiresias' speech, which looks beyond the bounds of the Odyssey as we know it. So this goes, Tiresias tells Odysseus of a prophecy of his sort of future, of what happens after he leaves, after he reaches Ithaca. And it's almost as if sort of Tiresias opens up a window into a different story, and he says, you know, no, once you get to Ithaca, you will have to go on yet another journey, and you will have to sacrifice to Poseidon, and only then, when you get to meet people that do not recognize your aura as such, you will have to sort of make a sacrifice to Poseidon, and that's basically when you've appeased the god. So Tiresias is basically, I think, launching a different tradition, and I think that is quite outstanding, because again, it could potentially have an alternative or a different tradition in which we see Odysseus on yet another journey. And what does that tell us about the characterization of Odysseus is that sort of that traveling element, which will then sort of be picked up by later retellings of the hero, is still very prominent. So reaching Ithaca, I think, is not the end all and be all. So Tiresias tells him about Ithaca, and the final, the final meeting of the sort of Ithaca encounters is a very tragic encounter with his mother, and it's very sad and it's very tragic, because Odysseus doesn't know that she has died when he was away. Okay? So Odysseus gets to the underworld, not knowing what he will find, and he finds his own mother. And again, Anticleia is her name, and she gives a lot of background information on Ithaca, and tells Odysseus that his own father, Laertes, is now not in charge of the household anymore, and he's sort of away and living away from the home, and that now Telemachus, Odysseus' son, is in charge of the household, but he's basically just a boy. And Anticleia provides Odysseus with the background on Penelope's suffering as well, which would fuel another hero, right? Would fuel any hero to wanting to return home a little bit more. So all of the things that these characters are saying to Odysseus, these sort of ghosts and images, fuels the hero to continue his nostos at a point in time in which he's lost sort of some of his companions and has been sort of traveling for a while. And this is, I put on the slide, Anticleia says that Penelope, she is certainly staying on steadfast in your house, but all the time her nights and days of misery are spent in tears. So again, that idea of Penelope grieving. And then we have the image of Odysseus trying to embrace his mother, but failing to do so because she's but a ghost. She's just a spirit. My mind was torn. I wanted to embrace the spirit of my dead mother. 3 times I tried to reach for her, to embrace her, and 3 times she slipped out of my arms like a shadow or a dream. This is a very evocative image, which those of you who might be familiar with the Aeneid will also have seen this when, for example, Aeneas attempts to both embrace his own father and died, of course. So those are the first 3 encounters, and they matter, as I said, because they provide Odysseus both with sort of background information that he hadn't before then, and they provide him, again, a reason for sort of continuing on that journey, right? Of continuing that. Now, we'll skip the catalogue of heroines, but we can talk more about that perhaps in the Q&A, because as we think about Ithaca, which is at the very end of the sort of the underworld journey, of the underworld episode, so we get there at the end of book 12, beginning of book 13, the underworld also looks back, and also looks back at Troy. And as I said, we have a distinction in heroism between Odysseus, I think, and others, and all the heroes that we will meet, other of those sort of encounters. The first person he meets after sort of we return from the break into the narrative is Agamemnon. He doesn't, I think, come across in the best of lights in Odyssey 11. As you may know, he has been murdered upon his return by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Okay? But after the Trojan War, he returns home just to find death at the hands of these two. And again, Homer, this is just as a something for you to think about as you continue reading the Odyssey for your studies. Homer uses the story of Agamemnon almost as a warning for Odysseus' own story of return, right? Because, and Agamemnon says in the meeting with Odysseus in Book 11, he absolutely berates his wife, which again understandable because he has been murdered. He has been murdered by her, but also continuously points out the difference between Clytemnestra and Penelope. So there is, and sort of, he underscores the importance of sort of having a faithful wife, and Penelope comes across as very, very loyal. Right? But then Agamemnon sort of makes a very quite a scathing comment about all women in general. It says you can't trust women. So when you arrive to Ithaca, don't let your ship sort of go openly into the harbor. Just go a different way so that you're not seen, right? Which is very helpful for Odysseus because it's a way of warning, in addition to what Tiresias has said to him, it's a way of warning him that trouble is in the house and that he has to be careful. Right? So we may not like Agamemnon as a whole, and I abstain judgment. Don't like him. Anyway, we may not like Agamemnon as a whole, but I think his characterization matters for Odysseus, and there's always a little bit of a tension between the two. The second encounter of the Trojan encounters is with the hero Achilles. So this is the moment, I think, in this encounter in which we see Odysseus being entirely a different hero from the Homeric heroes. And we also see Achilles pointing out that his death in Troy, right, his early untimely death in Troy, is something that he actually regrets. So, I on the slide, Odysseus says to Achilles, "No man is more blessed than you are. Right? You still lived. We Argives held you in equal honor, so we sort of honored you. We bestowed you with gifts. And now in this place, you are king among the dead." So Odysseus is saying, you are king here. You're the most important person in this underworld. So do not be angry in your death, Achilles, Odysseus says. But Achilles replies, "Do not talk to me lightly of death, glorious Odysseus. I had rather," so there's a little bit of mistakes there, but I will change that. "I had rather be above earth and a laborer for another man," so as a slave to another, "than be king of all the dead." So Achilles says, "I wish I hadn't died after." So he's very bitter, he's very angry. So I may put too much emphasis on this, but we do get the sense that the immortality through song promised in the Iliad, that destiny of Achilles in the Iliad, might be something that hasn't quite sort of hit the mark in a way. So this is something to think about, again, whether the Odyssey allows us to see a different characterization to the hero. But then Achilles asks about his son, because of course the father-son relationship is fundamental for epic. And Odysseus says really nice things about Neoptolemus. So Achilles, at the end of this conversation, is not happy and he actually moves away. And we are told that he was joyful that I, Odysseus, had told him about the glory of his son. Okay? So there's quite a lot to unpack, okay, in these conversations, but we start seeing that Odysseus might not be entirely the same sort of hero, or might not live any longer within sort of the Homeric picture of heroism that we've seen in the Iliad. So we see something a little bit different perhaps. And nowhere, I think, is Odysseus more different than his sort of Homeric companions, in a way, so those who fought with him at Troy, than with Ajax. Because I include this into sort of the three encounters of the Trojan side, but when Odysseus meets, Ajax here, there's not a conversation. Ajax is still mad that he didn't get the weapons of Achilles after the death of Achilles. And in the context of the arms, you might be familiar with this story, Ajax gets them, doesn't get them, and Achilles and Odysseus gets the arms of Achilles. And we're told that only the spirit of Aias, which is Ajax, stood aloof, angry at the victory I had won over him by the ships in the judgment for the arms of Achilles. How I wish I had never won when that was the nature of the prize. So great was the man that the earth took under because of that armor. Ajax, with looks and deeds, was sort of by far the greatest of all the Greeks. Remember that everything that you know about the wanderings comes from the point of view of Odysseus. So this is his own story. And it is quite interesting the way that Odysseus paints himself as somebody who actually did not care about the context. He says, "Oh, how I wish I never won," right? When if the nature of the prize was the fact that sort of that bitterness and that the refusal to speak that Ajax basically has with him. He has no answer from Ajax, so again we get the sense that kind of heroism that we saw in the not really in the Iliad, but in the sort of cycle after the events of the Iliad, we get the sense that heroism no longer matters as much in the new epic that is the Odyssey. Okay, so when you start thinking about again heroism, is not just one sort of term for all, but rather it changes, and I think the Odyssey gives a different picture of that, of the Iliad. Now I've sort of mentioned the catalogue of women, that we can talk about this, because I'm slightly conscious of time, but for a long time, let me just re-find the slide. Alright. So the catalogue of women, which we have there from lines 225 and 322, several scholars in the past have said, well, this sounds a bit weird, we don't know why we have these figures, these princesses telling their stories, because it's a bit bizarre that they are here in this, that they're presented in this manner. So why does Homer give way so much weight, to these women that actually have no bearing on the story? And if you're interested in that, I can recommend a piece by Doherty there, Gender and Internal Audiences in the Odyssey. And she makes the very brilliant point that in the court of the Phaeacians, we not only have Alcinous that Odysseus has to speak to, but actually we have Queen Arete. And she is as important in sort of the domestic sphere and in of the Phaeacians as her sort of male counterpart. So because the story is being told to these two, so not just to Alcinous and the Phaeacians, but also to his wife, by having these sort of women retelling, these queens and princesses, we see that it's actually quite crucial if Odysseus is to get home, because he has to appease Queen Arete. So again, something to think about. Okay, to wrap up then, why does the Underworld episode, which I've given you a major tour de force today, why does it matter for the Odyssey? In the first place, it tells us something about Odysseus. And most importantly, it tells Odysseus something about Ithaca and something about Troy. And we see Odysseus' relationship with his family, which we actually hadn't yet seen in the Odyssey. So in the first 11 books, the first 4 books, we see what happens to the household without him, but we never quite see sort of that relationship with his family. And as I said, the Underworld episodes and the conversations also sort of point us toward his purpose, right? So again, his nostos and why that is important to him. It's meant to, some of these conversations are meant to move you, to understand, to sympathize with Odysseus at this stage. The Underworld episode also tells us something different between the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we see, again, a different type of heroism. Odysseus is not like the heroes that we saw in the Iliad, because he has to adapt, right? This is not a battlefield, and he's probably the only one who can manage it. It also gives the Underworld episode also provides us with a glimpse of a different perspective after the Trojan War, through Agamemnon and through what he says, and again Achilles and Ajax. And also, it elevates the status of Odysseus. As I said before, it's not an easy feat to go down into the Underworld. The only one who properly did it was Heracles, which is the last one we actually see in the Odyssey, in the Underworld episode. So Odysseus' sort of status as a hero is elevated. He has now undergone something that only great epic heroes would undergo and would sort of manage. And finally, I think, which is also interesting, we catch a glimpse of what happens, what is supposedly going to happen after the Odyssey, with the prophecy of the future of Odysseus beyond the bounds of the Odyssey as we know it. So it's almost as if you get to the very end of the Odyssey and you're sort of thinking, okay, what next? Right? We know this is not the end. And I will stop talking now, but I thank you very much for your very kind attention, and I welcome any questions that you might have on this now. Thank you.
Okay, shall we give it? Right, we've got a range of questions, and I think we'll start off with ones that are linked to this section of the Odyssey.
Perfect.
So, Neve has a question linked to Odysseus and Anticlea, his mother.
I just want to know, how far do you blame Odysseus for the death of Anticlea?
Can I ask why you think that?
Because I personally think Odysseus, I know it's in the nature of the Homeric hero, but I think he spent far too long trying not to go home.
I think that's a very sort of fair point when you think about, again, Calypso, book 5, and also the duality of Odysseus, how he's presented there, in that he cries at night, well, he cries during the day and then sort of goes with Calypso at night, and the same with Circe, right? I also, if that's part of the argument, then I want you to think a little bit more about the nature of Homeric society and the fact that we can't quite see, again, the relationship between husband and wife in the way that we would like to sort of see that. So I don't know whether I would allow sort of I would make a difference in my reading as a person who reads it now and says, yes, God, what an interesting person you are, Odysseus, right? And sort of the ancient reader for whom I think the reunion and the shock that Odysseus must have felt seeing his mother coming towards him. So I would make a distinction. Thank you.
Okay, so are you saying the reader in ancient times would have more sympathy for Odysseus than we do today?
I would absolutely agree with that.
We judge him more harshly.
Yeah.
Right, staying with the underworld and the encounter with Ajax, we've got a question from Caitlin.
Did Odysseus get a silent treatment from Ajax?
Yes, that's exactly what happens. Yes, he received the silent treatment for Ajax. Yes. But as I said, think about one of the things about ancient emotions is that for emotions such as anger and grief, they have to stop at some point. What Odysseus says about his encounter with Ajax is that Ajax didn't actually let go. And Odysseus is sort of trying to come off as a better man, right? And saying, oh no, I wish I'd never won, but that wasn't quite the story. So yes, silent treatment. I'd agree with that, yeah.
Okay, Poppy had an interesting question about the summoning up of the dead, which occurs in the Odyssey.
Yeah.
And go on, Poppy.
How do you think like the culture surrounding raising the dead compares to our understanding of it now?
Okay, so can I ask what you mean by understanding of it now?
I suppose in modern religion it's kind of quite taboo.
I would say that part of the reason why Odyssey 11 has been read as a sort of because we have that element of that ritualistic sort of sacrifice. I would say that it was more normalized because, again, you have that that cultic element, which is very, I would say, natural, not natural, but very accepted. Later writers, actually, Roman writers, particularly, for instance, my author called Statius. Have you ever heard of him? He writes about epic, and he has a necromantic scene, and you're meant to see it as a lot darker, sort of more sort of gothic as perhaps we would read it. So I would say that it has been seen as different, perhaps. But again, the element of ritual sacrifice, the ancients were a lot more sort of used to it than we are. Does that make sense?
Right, we're going to go back to Anticlea. I think she's a character who has a lot of impact on my students. And Mina, you have a question on what the purpose of this is.
Yeah, I was just wondering, do you think that Homer includes like this encounter with his mother to arouse pathos, or is it more to remind him that he needs to go home? Like, is it to move the plot along, or to make us understand him as a family man?
I think it's both. I think one thing doesn't actually invalidate the other. And I think, again, the distinction between one of the elements of the Odyssey's memory, right? So we have both past. So Odysseus is sort of trapped between sort of past and future, right? So he has a pull towards the future, but a lot of things that he encounters, especially in the underworld, point him to the past. And I think part of the reason why he meets his mother is to, as you say, sort of help sort of fuel the plot, but also it's a very pathetic image. And I really want to sort of pinpoint how hard it must have been for him to sort of see his mother now. And Homer makes that very explicitly clear.
Okay, prophets. Odysseus's main purpose for going down to the underworld is to consult with Tiresias, who gives him some very specific information and the warning about the sun god's island. I think, Sasha, you've got a question on prophets.
I was just wondering, like, why Homer even includes prophets in the first place if the majority of the time nobody listens to them.
Yeah, that's fair. But do they, so to counter question, do they actually listen, do the companions listen to what Tiresias basically tells them? They eat the cattle, they slaughter it. So in a way, he includes it again to undermine it. Part of Tiresias' element. So yeah, prophets are really hard done by, I would say.
We get frustrated with them because you have Alcinous's father, Nausithous, warning the Phaeacians about, the consequences of giving safe passage, and Alcinous goes ahead and helps Odysseus anyway, even though he knows he's out of favour with Poseidon. And Theoclymenus gives warnings to the suitors, Halitherses, and they just don't get listened to.
Listen to him, no. And part of, I think, maybe I shouldn't say the scene of the suitors is that failure to heed warnings that were basically sort of flying about over and over again. So.
Okay, we're going to cast the net a bit wider now with the theme of Nostos, and Tate has a question.
How far do you think Odysseus is to blame for his delayed Nostos?
That's $1 million question, or pounds, or I think Odysseus has to do a very good job at explaining why he winds up in Ithaca. Well, he winds up at the court of the Phaeacians alone, right? So one of the ways to read the Wanderings is an exercise into trying to again explain why he has lost so many companions. I think the blame is not total. So I wouldn't, if I were to answer the question of to what extent do you think he's to blame, I would say that as a sort of leader and captain, he's sort of responsible. But for certain things, I think he's not. For example, again, the Castle of the Sun.
Okay, and we've got a question now about, back in Ithaca, Penelope and Telemachus. Oliver.
How far do you blame Penelope and Telemachus to the extent at which the suitors took control of Ithaca?
Yes.
Could they have managed the situation better?
I don't think they could have. Because think about how many suitors you have there, and think about the fact that Laertes is not part of the household of the Oedipus anymore. So he's sort of outside, he's old. So part of the reason why you want to have a man in the house is because, again, you might be able to manage mustering allies as well. So it's not just Odysseus himself, but it's the fact that when he returns to Ithaca, he has to make sure that he has allies around. So I don't think Penelope, as much as we want to read them as a sort of independent, one of my students referred to her as a girl boss. I don't know how I would, I wouldn't go as far. But I think it would be very difficult for me to blame Penelope and Telemachus, because he's but a boy. So part of the first 4 books of the Odyssey is to point out that he's going on a journey himself, right? And again, hearing his father. So I don't see how they would have done anything different. Oh, by the way, could I point out, if you're interested in Penelope's point of view and a retelling of Penelope, have you come across a book called The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood? It answers some of these questions. It's obviously a modern retelling, so it fills in the gap. And we see the point of view of Penelope of what happened to her in Ithaca. And she sort of points out all of these difficulties, the fact that she also has to manage the enslaved people. So anyway, that's something that you might, it's very, very short, and it's very nice.
Right, the next question is about how the epic is structured, and Light, it's your question about the return section. section.
Do you think the build-up in the return section is too long, and the revenge section is kind of like just too rushed?
The revenge, so in sort of book 21, the moment. I quite like a long delayed narrative. I think it sets the scene. I think it sets the scenes for like a climax, right? So do you mean the return, or do you mean the arrival of the?
So everything right from the start of the epic is kind of like too detailed, giving a lot of like explanations, and then when we get to him actually taking his revenge on the suitors, it's kind of like just maybe 2 pages of pages, like that's
very
the
short,
end.
yeah,
Very short. So what do you think about that? Do you think it's just like it doesn't really like complete the epic?
I think that's a very good question. I haven't thought about the image of sort of the moment of the stringing of the bow and the moment of the killing of the suitors. But think about that book 21, in which we have sort of the killing of the suitors, is the only moment of real battle that we get from the Iliad, that we get since the Iliad. So this is a sort of different kind of epic, and maybe the audiences were more familiar, perhaps with, again, the killing, overkilling, and sort of that we could have seen in the Iliad. So perhaps we had that climactic moment. It's a little bit shorter and condensed. Yeah. I like, as I said, I like the sort of the building up, because you can sort of see. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think we often feel when we're doing the return section, in book 16, book 17, great, lots of action. By the time we get to book 20, we feel it's over-egging the pudding a bit. There's just a bit too many episodes where we see Odysseus, beggar Odysseus, being abused, and it starts to drag a bit at that
It's
point.
a bit overkill.
Yeah, overkill.
I had never thought of it in those terms, but I'll have a think about the sort of the narrative phase. I also have to we have to take into account the composition of the Odyssey, right? So again, the Odyssey that we have, we don't quite know how we got it and what we have as well. And it was so it could have been down to taste of the audience requesting a particular part of the Odyssey to the bard. But
Right, we've got a couple of questions now on Odysseus's father, Laertes. One from Sasha, and then Francesca's got a follow-up one. Sasha.
Do you feel that Laertes lets his family down by sort of he doesn't really take charge, he just accepts the sadness and goes away?
I think this goes back to the idea of sort of excessive emotions. That's a very good question about excessive emotions in archaic Greece and which sort of gets filtered down in Roman times. Grief can be excessive and overwhelming, and again, we can perhaps read Laertes as somebody who didn't really fulfill his job, so to speak, right? But again, in the Homeric world, there is the idea that once sort of the elderly, once sort of people become too old, you are supposed to have the young sort of men taking charge. So it's about the absence of the male figure of the exact proper age that it manages again the estate in a way. So again, Laertes is too old. So again, from what I've understood of the Homeric society, you can't really blame him. No, I wouldn't.
Okay, Francesca?
Well, I agree with you that I wouldn't blame him. But if you were to take the point of blaming him, do you think at the end he redeems himself when he like suppresses the family of the suitors?
Yes, but I also think that So I also think that the way he acts with Odysseus in the recognition scene at the very end, I think that I wouldn't blame him, but I think there is something interesting about the relationship that he has with Odysseus, because you remember where the lying tale, so the things that Odysseus says to different members of his household, right? And he lies and says, I'm from Crete and so on. by the time we get to Laertes, and by the time we have the recognition scene with Laertes at the end of the epic, it's not needed. And Odysseus sort of, it feels very cruel to do that to sort of your own father. So again, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know, it's not perhaps what you want to hear, but all I want to say is that we have perhaps also different perspectives on that. Yeah, I would say he might sort of redeem himself at the very end. But again, I don't think he's to blame, so I wouldn't have to redeem him.
The next question, this could relate to the Aeneid, maybe even more so to the Aeneid, where in Book 6 you've got a really long book on the underworld, and some of the students love it. They love all the detail, they love all the encounters with ghosts from the people from the past, all the description of the monsters and the various different categories of people suffering, and others feel that it's overkill, it's too much. Arwa, could we have your question?
Would you say that the ancient Greeks were related and found it more impactful to have the underworld section, or would you that in comparison to the modern world?
Yes, because I think it's a very compelling tale, and I think it's a very compelling element of the story. And I think we need to take into account the context in which Virgil is writing, because his underworld is sort of littered with very sort of historical figures, founders of Rome. So Virgil is writing the underworld for a particular reason, I think. Whereas the underworld of the Odyssey is not as, again, can I say propagandistic as the one that we might see in Virgil. But I just think it's just a very, very good story. And I think that it continues to fascinate even nowadays, because if once you start looking for them, you will see descents into the underworld in pretty much a lot of movies. Several movies, but for example, have you heard of the movie Parasite? Yeah? There is a scene, and there is a scene in which we have a descent into the underworld when they go from the very rich man's house to the very poor house in which they live in, and it has been entirely flooded. And even though we have no monsters and we have no underworld, we have no ghosts, the idea of a descent into sort of murky place is, again, I think, part of our understanding of the underworld. So I think it's just a very compelling story. So you can take it, and you can take its features and still make it recognizable as such, I think.
Okay, final second year question, Lewis.
How far would you say Odysseus is to blame for the deaths of his crew?
Can I be very diplomatic here and say 50-50?
Okay.
Think about the bag of winds. Think about, think about the sirens, right? You can both blame him for wanting to know more, but you can also see the companions' sort of greed. And at times, also, Odysseus is to blame, I think, because he doesn't quite share the information with his companions. So maybe 60-40.
Are there any first years who would like to ask a question? They've not had the chance to plan and prep, but if you have, feel free. No? Right, should we turn to Heidi's got a question, I think specifically to Classics at Manchester.
So like how does the course kind of work in terms of the kind of like I'm basically more specific. Do you kind of know what I'm trying to ask?
I know what you're trying to do.
Are you asking what the course covers?
Yeah.
What's on the course?
So, what do you mean, the Odyssey module, or do you mean the
just the whole?
Right. So are you interested in classics, classical studies?
Classical studies.
Classical studies, right. So I think Andy would correct me if I'm wrong on classical studies, but you have sort of some core modules that you can do. But then, again, it's sort of optional. You can take also other modules in other departments as well. But for example, what you can expect from your first year, you will do the Odyssey in the first semester, and then you will do the Aeneid in the second semester. And again, you can sort of, I would say you're pretty flexible with the choices that you can make, right? Yeah, okay. So you can sort of tailor it to your interests, depending. But if you're interested, just I'll leave you my email when we can be in touch and talk about it.
Could you say a bit about, because often when students do classical studies, there's also the opportunity to do some language learning of Latin and Greek. How does that work on the course? Is it something you opt into?
Yeah, so basically, if you're interested in doing a language, which, by the way, I will wholeheartedly sort of recommend, because I think that it's just excellent. You have two. You have intensive Latin and you have intensive Greek, which is basically in 1 year, so in 2 semesters, you are basically at an A-level level by the end of this sort of intensive year. So you can have basically 0 languages and start a language from scratch at university and basically build up. So you can do it.
But what if you already know kind of the basics of, for example, Greek or like Italian, for example? Does that matter? Does that help, or does that not influence?
That it wouldn't influence from the fact that you will probably have to start from scratch, but it would be very helpful. I mean, Latin for me as an Italian might have been a little bit more sort of easier to get my teeth into. But again, you can start from the very beginning, but you can also choose, if you say that you don't want to do it in your first year, you can opt in sort of the second year. So you're flexible to choose a language, Latin or Greek, from scratch.
Could I just throw in as another thing that Manchester, which is quite rare actually in British universities, but if anybody is into Egyptology, there is now a chance to learn hieroglyphs as well as an extra.
I have a question. You sometimes read things and you don't know whether they're true or whether they're myths, and I can't remember where I read this, but I read somewhere that admissions tutors don't even look at personal statements. Is that true, or is it still a really important part of the application? And if so, maybe Andy can come in here.
Answer,
What are you looking for?
Okay, so personal statements. The answer, I think it's fair to say, is that this will come into play particularly where there are borderlines, right? So all universities are given a quota of students who they're meant to take every year. At Manchester it'll be around, they haven't actually told me yet, even though I'm the admissions tutor, which is interesting, isn't it? But it'll be around 95, right? Now, what we do is at Manchester we will make you a basic offer of an A and 2 Bs at A level. That's the line, okay? But that line can, if the numbers don't fit together, become a bit more flexible. So if you get A, B, C, for example, we might be interested in you coming along. It's at that moment, I think, where the personal statement will come into play. Okay? The most important thing, and I want to be honest with people in the group, because I think that's the right thing to do, is the most important thing to get the original offer from the university will be the predicted grades that you get from your teachers. Right? So if somebody says this student is likely to get, say, 3 Bs, I would still make you an offer, because I would think that's realistic. If somebody works hard, they really want to do it, they can bounce a B to an A, or they can bounce a C to a B. Yeah? If somebody said, I'm afraid this student's going to get, say, a B and 2 Ds or something like that, then I think it's fair to say that the university would not be likely to make you an offer, although there are schemes, and if anyone's interested, I can certainly pass this on to your teachers, whereby at Manchester, if you take some sorts of courses, we can actually make you an offer which drops a grade, right? And I can provide that information later on. But the personal statement, where it's important, I think, is where these borderlines come in. Then we will look, and what we'll be looking for is an interest in the subject, perhaps expressing a bit of knowledge about the subject, where you feel you'd like to go with that knowledge, and things of that nature. So My view would be, why should I take this person on my course? The last thing I want on my course is a student who's just sleepwalking into this and there's no interest in the subject, because that would be boring for them. It's also boring for me as a teacher. So what you've got to do is express that little bit of interest. Why do I want to do this, as opposed to, say, brain surgery? Yeah? And if you can do that for me, that's where it's going to matter. But the most important thing for the baseline will be your predicted grades. All right? And again, if those predicted grades are only 1 or 2 off where the base offer is, you're likely to get a conditional offer, because we feel, if you want to do this, there's some work to be done, but you can put that work in and realistically you can get there. So that's also important in all of this. I hope that's a reasonable comment. Again, if people are interested in these other schemes, I will provide that information. I can grab some stuff from Manchester, bring it down here, and you can then have a look at it.
And would it be accurate to say, Andy, that citing things like attending this talk, going on trips, reading an extra book on the subject, that would all
absolutely, because that's showing you're interested in the subject. Yeah. So what we want are students who are keen, who will actually go away and then at university browse the bookshelf, and not just the 2 things we want you to do for the essay, but they'll see an extra book next to it and think, hey, that sounds really interesting, I'll have a go at that one as well. So if you can show you've been doing that here at Sixth Form College, that is obviously going to stand you in good stead.
So keep a log, attended the talk, tick, went on the Chester trip, tick, went to the British Museum, all the things you saw there, tick, and refer to them in your...
Absolutely, yeah.
Helping out at open evening as well, enthusing parents and students to come in the future to take up classics would be another good thing. So we've heard it there from the horse's mouth. Personal statement is important, and make sure if you want to do classics, ancient history, archaeology, that you can really show that interest in the subject. Right. Okay, so I think we've had a very enriching afternoon. Shall we give one final